A 34-year-old elementary school teacher was halfway through her second crossword puzzle when both pilots stopped responding from the cockpit at 38,000 feet. The plane kept flying straight for now, but the silence on the intercom changed everything. And the only person who might keep 217 souls alive was the woman in seat 17C that the flight attendants had politely ignored for most of the boarding process. Elena Vargas wasn't anyone's idea of a hero. She was the quiet passenger who always chose the window seat, wore comfortable sneakers, and carried a well-worn notebook everywhere. But in that moment, with the autopilot holding steady and the cabin crew realizing the worst had already begun, Elena faced a choice no training could prepare her for. Before we go further, drop a comment below. Have you ever been in a moment where you had to choose between what was safe and what was right? And if stories like this are what you're here for, subscribe. More coming. Because this wasn't just about a plane in trouble. This was about a woman who carried quiet knowledge from years ago that the entire cabin would soon need more than anything else in the world. To the rest of the world, Elena was easy to overlook. The kind of passenger flight attendants smiled at kindly while moving on to someone louder or more important. They treated her with gentle politeness, the way you treat someone who seems perfectly fine exactly where she is. During boarding, she had carefully arranged her small carry-on, double-checking that her seatbelt was fastened the moment she sat down, then pulled out her crossword book and a pen. She worked methodically, filling in answers while the plane taxied, humming softly to herself, just another traveler trying to pass the time. Later, in the quiet of her apartment weeks before this flight, she had sat at her kitchen table with the one object she never left home without, a small silver pilot's wing pin her father had given her on her 16th birthday. The pin was slightly tarnished now, the edges worn smooth from years of her fingers tracing it during hard moments. She had turned it over in her hands that night, remembering his voice, before tucking it into the front pocket of her travel bag. "You're so good at what you do," her principal had told her at the end of the last school year, patting her shoulder. "The kids love you. It's perfect for you." The words were warm. They also meant this was probably as far as anyone expected her to go. She settled into her seat as the plane climbed, the hum of the engines steady around her. On the surface, everything felt calm. Underneath, that old familiar unease stirred, the sense that life might one day ask more of her than she had ever been allowed to give. What no one on that flight knew was that Elena had spent hundreds of hours in small planes with her father, a retired flight instructor who had lost his medical certificate after a heart scare, but never lost his love for teaching. The memories came back in fragments. The smell of avgas on warm mornings, the way the yoke felt alive under her hands during gentle turns, the sound of her father's calm instructions cutting through engine noise. He had taken her up again and again, even after she chose teaching instead of aviation. One clear Saturday, he had her practice emergency procedures until her arms ached. "When will I ever need to know this, Dad?" she had asked, frustrated and tired. He had looked at her across the cockpit, eyes steady. "You'll know, and when you do, everything changes." He taught her to read instruments by feel, to trust the horizon, to understand how pressure systems affect a plane at altitude. A surprising fact wove through those lessons. At cruising altitude, even a small change in cabin pressure can affect seasoned pilots faster than most people realize, especially if they've been skipping proper hydration and rest. Elena remembered the exact warning signs he had drilled into her. The memories faded as the plane leveled out. Elena was just turning to a new page in her crossword when the first odd note reached her. A subtle change in the engine tone that made her pause, pen hovering over the paper. It was late afternoon somewhere over the Midwest. Golden sunlight slanted through the cabin windows, catching dust motes in the air. The plane cruised smoothly at 38,000 feet under a clear sky, the kind of flight where passengers had already settled into their routines. Flight attendant Carla moved down the aisle with practiced warmth, checking on families. Captain Ramirez, a veteran with 20 years on this route, had made the usual welcome announcement with easy confidence. First Officer Chen, newer but sharp, had chatted briefly with passengers near the front. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. Elena noticed one small thing and dismissed it. The way the captain had cleared his throat twice during the announcement, a little rougher than usual. She told herself it was just dry cabin air. Another detail slipped past most people. One of the overhead vents near the cockpit door was blowing noticeably cooler than the others. Small. Significant. Nothing that looks fine is always fine. The seatbelt sign stayed off, but Elena felt a tiny shift in the plane's attitude, almost imperceptible. She glanced toward the cockpit door. No one else seemed to notice. Am I imagining this? A flight attendant knocked on the cockpit door and received no answer. Standard calls went unanswered. The plane continued on autopilot, but the silence stretched longer than any normal bathroom break or rest period. Elena watched, saying nothing yet, her fingers tightening around her pen. When the door was finally opened with the emergency key, both pilots were slumped in their seats, unresponsive. The cabin crew's training kicked in, but the situation was already beyond anything they had prepared for at this altitude. Panic began to ripple through the cabin as the reality settled in. No one on board was rated to fly this aircraft. Elena could stay in her seat like everyone else, hoping someone more qualified would appear. Or she could stand up and reveal knowledge that might make her look foolish if she was wrong. The weight of 200 lives pressed against the weight of her own doubt. Both paths terrified her in different ways. Stay with me here, because what happens in the next few minutes is the part nobody talks about. And once you hear it, you won't forget it. Think about what you would have done in their position. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. Elena unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Flight attendant Carla met her in the aisle first, voice gentle but firm. Ma'am, please sit down. We have this under control. When Elena kept moving forward, another crew member stepped in with more authority. We appreciate your concern, but we need passengers to remain seated. When their attempt to reach air traffic control for guidance resulted in garbled instructions that only made the plane drift slightly off course, the fear in the cabin became palpable. Elena spoke clearly. The autopilot is holding, but we're losing cabin pressure slowly. I can see it in the way the instruments are reading. We need to descend to 10,000 feet gradually while maintaining heading. She proved it by naming the exact altitude where hypoxia symptoms would have hit the pilots based on their last radio check, then reached past them to adjust one switch with the precise motion her father had shown her, an action only someone with stick time would know. She asked a technical question about the plane's current fuel burn rate that exposed how little real-time flying experience the crew had in this exact scenario. Carla looked at her, the weight of the decision heavy in her eyes. Then she stepped aside. Help us. Elena's hand brushed the silver wing pin in her pocket. For the first time, it didn't feel like a memory of what she left behind. It felt like it had been waiting for this exact moment. She caught sight of a little girl 3 rows back, clutching her stuffed bear, eyes wide with trust. That was what was truly at stake. Elena's hands shook as she slid into the captain's seat, but she forced her breathing to stay even. The instruments glowed with data, while her body registered the sheer impossibility of what she was doing. In her mind, her father's voice arrived steady and clear. You'll know. And when you do, everything changes. The actual situation was critical. Both pilots were breathing, but unresponsive. They had roughly 20 minutes before the slow pressure loss became dangerous for everyone. Resources were limited, autopilot still engaged, radio contact patchy, and one passenger with long-forgotten hours in small Cessnas. The plan came out simple and firm. We descend controlled. I keep the wings level. You handle communications and cabin. She began step by step. First she confirmed the autopilot settings and disengaged only the altitude hold, explaining each move so the crew could follow. She watched the vertical speed indicator carefully, making tiny corrections that kept the descent gentle. Carla's voice grew steadier as she relayed Elena's instructions to air traffic control. Even the most doubtful crew member fell silent, watching her hands on the yoke. Then came the crisis within the crisis. A sudden gust at 30,000 feet caused the plane to roll slightly, something her father's small planes had never prepared her for in a heavy jet. The passengers gasped. For a heartbeat, everything felt lost. Elena didn't fight the controls harder. Instead, she reached over and rested her hand briefly on the unconscious captain's shoulder, a small gesture of shared fear and shared duty. The simple human contact steadied her more than any instrument could. It was out of place in the cockpit, which was exactly why it belonged there. The final approach to a safer altitude stretched out in slow, deliberate seconds. Every adjustment of the yoke, every glance at the attitude indicator, every breath felt eternal. The prophetic line returned as the plane passed through 20,000 feet. "You'll know. And when you do, everything changes." She whispered it like an anchor. The moment of maximum doubt came when the plane shuddered through a layer of turbulence. Elena's throat went dry. She held on. The descent leveled out imperfectly. The plane arrived at a breathable altitude with a slight yaw that took extra minutes to correct. Not a triumph. A survival. A true one. Silence filled the cockpit. A full paragraph of it. The engines hummed steadily. The sky outside remained vast and indifferent. But the plane flew on, level and safe. Elena's body released its tension, all at once. Her hands trembled so badly she had to rest them in her lap. Her legs felt weak. An unexpected urge to laugh and cry at the same time washed over her as the cabin crew took over. Carla spoke first, voice thick. "You kept us together. Thank you." The most skeptical crew member didn't speak. He simply met Elena's eyes and gave a small, respectful nod that carried everything words couldn't. Passengers reacted in waves, some crying quietly, others reaching out to touch her arm as she walked back through the cabin. One elderly man pressed a packet of cookies into her hands with shaking fingers. Official response came over the radio, calm professionalism directing them to the nearest airport, layered beside the raw gratitude visible in every crew member's face. Weeks later, Elena stood on a quiet airfield with her father. No big celebration, just the two of them watching small planes take off. What passed between them needed few words. He placed his hand on her shoulder. She covered it with her own. Mutual recognition. She pulled out the silver wing pin one final time. It caught the sunlight, no longer a reminder of paths not taken. It had become proof of the path she had found when it mattered most. Elena stood alone for one moment on the edge of the tarmac, before the world rushed back in, watching the horizon stretch wide and open. Months later, back in her classroom, Elena moved through ordinary days that no longer felt entirely ordinary. Students looked at her differently now, though she never told the full story. The recognition sat on her shoulders in a way that still felt slightly borrowed. One quiet afternoon, she sat with her father on the same old airfield bench where they had shared so many lessons. The smell of grass and fuel hung in the warm air. He looked out at the runway for a long moment. "Were you ready for that plane, Elena? Or did that plane reveal you were ready all along?" The question lingered, demanding no easy answer. "Leave your answer below." I genuinely read every comment. Was she ready for that moment? Or did the moment make her ready? What would you have done? Her father finally answered softly. Maybe both. Maybe the only thing that matters is you didn't let go of the yoke when every part of you wanted to. If this story moved you, I have more where this came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment below telling me which moment in this story stayed with you. I genuinely want to know. The plane had kept flying that day not because everything was perfect, but because one ordinary passenger refused to let it fall.